So this was actually one of the questions here that we had, and I want you to try to remember what were the four that we've talked about so far. We've had four more in our readings. What were four of the proofs or arguments that we have discussed so far? So those are them up there, you can see. And yeah, I wanted to review the ontological argument because I thought it's very interesting. So let's just go through the proof. This is one version of it. There's several. You'll see that each of these arguments or proofs have different versions because so many people have worked on them from at different points. And so whether or not you agree with it, like obviously this course isn't a course that's trying to convince you to agree or disagree with this. It's just to look at the rationality and how it's based on very logical and reasonable syllogisms as well as processes. So it's kind of to give you a little bit of an appreciation and respect instead of just saying, okay, there's these ideas and we can just shoot them down easily. Well, they're a little bit more difficult to shoot down. This is one version of the ontological argument that I found very interesting. So the first premise here, so just remember everything will have to follow from the first premise. So when you make a statement, it means that nothing else that follows it can contradict the first statement, right? Okay, so the first statement is, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. So if you start with that's possible, then you can work through this. Now, if you don't think it's possible, and then you'd have to give a reason why it's not possible. But that would be the place to start if you want to, combat this argument. So, 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Okay, so does that make sense so far? What is a possible world? More later, but so possible worlds is interesting, right? Because I think there's an overlap. I wouldn't say 100% because I'm sure there's some distinctions that we could make, but people have come up with the idea of a multiverse, right? So some physicists are really into this and take it seriously. I don't know, I don't know what you think. I don't know what some of the philosophical arguments that you might use for or against it. I kind of have some of my own. I don't want to go into that in detail, but it is interesting to think about how there could be a multiverse, and that kind of is somewhat related. Even before people came up with this idea of multiverse, people talked about possible worlds. That if there is other worlds besides the one that we experience right now, not to say that they wouldn't be material. It's possible that the possible worlds are all material as well. So if there is possible worlds, the argument here goes that a maximally great being exists in some possible world. So number 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it follows that it would exist in every possible world. Okay, because by definition of being maximally great, it wouldn't be great maximally if it didn't exist in every possible world. It would only be partially great, right? Do you guys, you see the difference? So it couldn't be, so by the nature of being maximally great, then in existing in some possible world, then it would have to exist in all of the worlds because it's maximally great. Otherwise, we have to take away the term maximally great. We just have to say it's partially great, or in some sense great. Lydia, could you read number 4 for us?
If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world.
Right, so it follows the second part of number 3, right? It must exist in every possible world. So if it exists in every possible world, then it has to exist in this one, because this one is also one of the possible worlds. The world that we're in right now is one of the possible worlds. So therefore, that being that it was in all, possible worlds, then also has to be in this possible world, this world that actually exists. So number 5, Wei Le, could you read that?
If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists.
Right, so if, again, it follows the last part of number 4. If there is this existing being in the actual world, then that just means that it exists, right? And then number 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Okay, so how about you guys? What do you think some objections, what would you raise as objections to this ontological argument? you can have all kinds of things in the possible world, right? You can have
Aliens.
pardon me?
Aliens.
Aliens, right? So we have
Ghosts.
we have some sort of weird alien. I'm trying to draw an alien with weird eyes, kind of. I don't know. This is my alien. Okay. This is the alien in that world, in the possible world. So you could have aliens. You can have unicorns, right? We talked about unicorns before. The horse with the. I'm sorry, my drawing is horrible. But you can have unicorns in the possible world. You can have pigs. Can pigs fly in this world? No. But we can have pigs flying in the possible world. So you can have all kinds of things that are in the possible world. But in the actual world, we don't have those things. So, but the question, I would raise an objection to your objection, and that would be, sure, you could have all these things in the possible world, but that doesn't mean that. But it's exactly true what you said. They doesn't mean that they exist in the actual world, but they're not maximally great. There's nothing that is required of them to exist in an actual world, right? There's no requirement. They have no requirement. You mentioned like other things, like okay, maybe there's alien pigs that fly, unicorns or whatever. Just because of their being, no problem. Just because they exist in that world, what makes them have to exist in the actual world? What is it about them? Nothing. But a maximally great being, what makes a maximally great being have to exist? If he's maximally great, what makes him have to exist in our actual world?
To help people like just away from the disaster or something like that.
Not necessarily, because we're only talking about one quality. We're not even talking about goodness. We're not talking about help. We're talking about one thing. What is that one thing? What's the one quality that we've talked about for this maximally great being? It's in the word, maximally great being. Great, or an adverb that comes before great, sorry. What is it? Maximally. What does it mean to be maximally great? Actually, maximally great isn't just huge. It's the most great. Like, so, right? Like, it's you can't have anything greater. If this maximally great being was maximally great in some of the possible worlds, but he wasn't, or she wasn't, maximally great in the actual world, then that would be a contradiction of terms. It would no longer be maximally great. Right?
Right.
So that means that it would have to also be in the actual world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so see how hard this is. It's not that easy to defeat this argument. So, but keep thinking. What would be another argument? Can you think of something else that could defeat this argument? This is the kind of thinking I want you guys to do. I want you to be able to think for yourselves and come up with arguments, because you might discover something new. It's possible. One thing you can do is when you get home, if you get interested in this topic in particular, and you want to do it as part of the review in your presentation, try to watch some videos on it, see what other people have said, because there's some smart people that have come up with actually arguments against this as well. So you should think about it and see. But you might actually come up with your own argument that would actually defeat this. First, okay, so here it is. So yeah, cosmological, everything has a cause. So then the problem becomes, what caused God, right? That's the question. So if everything has a cause, what caused God? What's the problem with then saying, for example, let's just say there's no cause for God? What's wrong with that? Why can't I just say there's no cause for God?
Because this argument, the first cause argument, if there's no cause for why God exists, so it will be like kind of contradictory for this argument.
Exactly, it's totally contradictory. It's a pretty stupid argument, actually, if you think about it, right? Like, so if you can't say everything has a cause if you're going to say one thing doesn't have a cause, and it's what we would call special pleading, because you're being special to this one argument. So another problem that, and this is Warburton pulls out here, is that you have infinite regression as a possibility. Okay, so why not just have one cause that just caused one cause that just caused one cause? So for causes, it could just go on for infinity. And that is analogous to infinity going forward, actually. Why can't you just add one? Like, so you can always just add one to a number, and that number can continue on forever. So, so even if you do agree to the first cause argument, and you say, I think the first argument, basically, the first criticism, the first objection of what caused God, nothing caused God, if you say that and then you say, well, that's special pleading, that's enough to defeat the argument. But even if you do take it seriously to some degree, there's some limitations. And the first limitation is that there's some attributes of a traditional God that aren't necessarily explained. So you can't really talk about God's goodness. Just because there's some sort of cause, it doesn't mean that he's all good. Just because he or she has, some sort of causation doesn't mean he or she knows everything, right? So the traditional God view isn't satisfied just by having a first cause. And then again, I noticed that Warburton pulls out the problem of evil, but again, I feel like that's kind of out of place. The reason I'm bringing up Socrates here is because we're going to get into the Aristotelian proof for the existence of God. And in the Aristotelian proof of the existence of God, you can see this proof, which is about 2,500 years old or so. It actually, or 2,300 years old if it begins with Aristotle, but you actually see part of it originated in Plato and probably in Socrates as well. So Socrates came first, 470 to 399 BC, and then after that you have Plato. Now, this is an interesting painting by Raphael. It's called The School of Athens, and it has the two great philosophers that came after Socrates. Do you see them in the middle of this painting? So, yeah, two old men there in the middle. The one to your left, who is that? Who do you think that is?
Socrates.
Is it Socrates? What about the one to the right?
Should be like Plato.
Okay, actually, this is a painting of Socrates' students, you could say.
Also,
So the one to the left is
actually Aristotle.
the one to the left is actually Plato, and the one to the right is who?
His student.
Yes, Plato's student, Aristotle. So kind of the grandson, you could say, intellectually of Socrates. So Plato, why is he pointing up? You see how he's pointing up?
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, he's pointing up. Why is he pointing up?
Maybe he just said to his student, there is a God.
Okay, maybe he's saying that. And then how is Aristotle pointing? What is he pointing? Or maybe not pointing. He's more kind of putting his hand out, isn't he?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so why is he putting his hand out? What is he indicating with his hand?
So, like, because, from a perspective,
Okay.
the Plato point up and the Aristotle point down, right? So, from a perspective, one is heaven, one is hell.
Okay, one is heaven, one is hell. This is interesting because they had opposite perspectives on some issues.
Right.
So Plato had some ideas that Aristotle basically had almost the opposite ideas on. They actually have a lot they had in common too. But the reason probably why Plato is pointing up is he's famous for some concepts, and one of these concepts is called the world of ideas, or ideals. Sorry, world of ideals. And in this world of ideals, the concepts can be immaterial. Certain kinds of things are immaterial, and in his view, in a third kind of world. So you could have the earth and the things of this earth, and then you have maybe concepts about this earth, and those concepts about this earth are then connected. Those universals, he would call them, are connected to another world, this kind of Platonic world. And so his concepts basically shaped this idea of dualism, that there can be matter and then that there can be mind, and the mind can be separate from matter. Aristotle had a different point of view. So Plato kind of believed we need to start with the ideals of things, the concepts of things, and then move to, okay, then that explains the particular things. And I'm going to explain that in more detail. But Aristotle was the opposite perspective. Aristotle believed we needed to understand the general things, the universal things, by studying the particular things. To study, how do things actually work, and from that we can make generalizations. So there are two different points of view that have shaped Western philosophy. Now I'm just going to write up here. I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of what Platonic thought was like. Okay. So we can start with, for Plato, we can maybe start with something like, let's do a triangle. Okay. Now, what is this? What is this?
Triangle.
It's a triangle, right? Is it a triangle?
Maybe.
Maybe. How do you know it's a triangle?
three line combined.
There's three sides combined. And what else tells you that it's a triangle?
My math teacher.
Okay, your math teacher, but that's just authority. We know that from our teachers. It's true. Probably it's the main reason we know it. But is there another reason why?
For the shape, they have a triple angle.
Right, there's these three different angles, and what do you guys remember what they add up to? What should
180.
180, right? Degrees. Okay, so there's three sides and 180 degrees. Okay, so the triangle, but this is a problem, right? Because we've said this is a triangle, or we think it's a triangle. We add it up, but actually if we do the math and we make this is actually probably maybe like, I don't know, 60 something, maybe it's 62. This is maybe like what?
65.
Okay, 65. What about this one here?
53.
Okay, so that doesn't add up. We don't add up to 180, do we? So is it still a triangle?
No.
It's not, right? Also, this one right here, they should be a straight line, but look how this is kind of like, not exactly straight. So it makes you wonder, okay, so it's not a triangle. So have we ever seen a perfect triangle? Like in
60,
nature?
60, 60.
Where it should be 80, yeah, it should be 60, 60, 60, right? It's actually not perfect. It's not a perfect, you can't actually add it up to 180 in this situation, let's say, right? And you can't add this one up to 180. So is there anything in nature that resembles a perfect triangle? Have you ever come across a perfect triangle in nature? I'm not talking about a man-made, because man-made we could make it. We can make one, right? But in nature, is there a perfect triangle?
No.
Maybe there is. Actually, I don't know the answer to that question. But I've never seen one.
Right.
And if I did, I don't think I ever thought about it. I didn't learn about triangles by looking at nature. I didn't learn that way. Now, Euclid is the one who came up with the formula for the triangle. And I don't know, it could be that he was seeing triangles all over the place, but probably not, right? He probably was thinking about this a lot. So how does the concept of a triangle exist if you can't actually verify it in nature? And so Plato's, now I'm not asking you to answer that, but Plato's answer to that was that this concept exists somewhere, but it's not in material things. It's somehow immaterial. And he goes on and says, it's not just this, but you could also do that with math. We could do it with certain things that are like redness, blueness, where we can agree. People can, it doesn't matter what language or culture you come from, you can have a general agreement on certain colors. Maybe not for everyone at all times, but we kind of have a general sense of some concepts that we can share that don't necessarily, they can't necessarily be explained by the particular things that you would come in contact with in observation. So, with nature, natural observation. So the Aristotelian proof, and you can see that Aristotle was from 384 to 322 BC. And what Aristotle started with, and this was in the reading, and this was maybe what was difficult on the quiz, was that does change occur? What did Aristotle say about this? Does change occur or does it not occur? Right. Aristotle said that change occurs. And yeah, so he was for it. And then what about this other guy, Parmenides and Zeno? No, they said it does not occur. So they were in a debate about this, and Zeno actually comes a little later, I think, than Aristotle, or he was maybe only 10 years old when Aristotle died, so he wasn't really debating Aristotle, but Parmenides for sure, Aristotle was debating, and he says, yes, change can occur, and the way he wants to talk about it is in terms of potentials and actuals. So what does it mean to have a potential? Do you guys have an idea what a potential is?
It's kind of the things that never change.
No, it's not that something never changes.
Unless it's permanent, I'm not sure.
Yeah, potential.
Potential is kind of like, it's not direct, it's indirect. Like, you sometimes see the potential intelligence, something like that. The potential is something like, you might have this
Right.
activity, you might have this skill, but you have to discover it, you have to search about it.
Right.
To show your skills.
Right. So the whole idea is that potential means that it's latent, is another term for this, that it's not yet there, but it could be there. It could come about. In the last slide, we talked about that change actually does occur. And so we talked about potential and actual. And I'll define a little bit what that is. So, according to Aristotle, everything that can change has a potential for change, but it needs something actual to make that potential come into place, to make that actually actual. So there has to be an actualizer. There has to be an agent that causes something that's potentially changed to becoming actually changed. So, for example, my hand here, if I have my hand here and then I put it to the left, right? When it was here, we could call it potentially to the left, right? My hand just here is potentially to the left. It's potentially a lot of things. It's potentially to the right, potentially up, it's potentially grabbing something. All of those things are potential, but they don't become actual until something causes them or causes it to become actual. So what is it when I move my hand to the right? What is it that actually is causing it to go or to the left? What's causing it to go to the left? Yes, but what causes that change? It's simple if you just think of it in terms of physiology, right? Yeah, so your mind, your brain is telling you something, right? So what's the brain doing? It's sending a signal through your nervous system, right? It goes through our nervous system. Nervous system has things that we call neurons. So there's muscular neurons. So actually, most immediately, we can say the muscular neurons are causing the hand to go to the left, right? But those muscular neurons are connected to other neurons, which is connected to my whole nervous system, which goes to my brain, right? But what is actually holding that in place? What causes that to do that? Well, it's my entire, you could say, molecular structure of my entire body, right? So you can keep going back to something that's actualizing a potential, that's then actualizing another potential, that's actualizing another potential, that's actualizing another potential, right? So we can see this progression. So this is different than, realize that this is different than the cause argument. We talked in the last, before you came back, Jallo, we talked about how everything has a cause. This isn't saying everything has a cause. This is saying everything that changes has something that actualizes that change, okay? And it has to do with right here and right now. Another example of this could be, and this is also from Faser's book, is like but he says it a little differently. But when I bought this coffee, what kind of coffee was this? Was this hot or cold when I bought it?
Dark.
It's dark coffee, right? Was it hot or was it cold? What do you think?
Cold.
It was cold. Yeah, I got a cold coffee this morning, cold brew, had some nice ice in it and everything. Well, what's happened to the temperature of this coffee since I've gotten it? Is it still cold? You think this is still cold?
Yeah. Yes.
You think it still is? It's actually not. It's actually almost the temperature of the room, right? So to me, I mean, everybody's going to be different, but to me, that's not cold. It's lukewarm. It's not hot. It would take a lot for it to become hot, right? Actually, if I just leave it outside, because it's going to be a hot day today, if I left it in the sun, it could almost become hot. But it's not, and I'm actually going to take a sip. Still good. Still tastes good. But the point being that there was a change that occurred. My coffee went from cold and really nice, super refreshing, to now being kind of lukewarm. And so that change went from a potential to an actual, okay? Also, my hand was potentially left, then it became to the left, right? So, okay, if change is going from potential to actual, how does that actually happen, right? And so something can go from potential to actual if there's something already actual that can make it happen. So that's kind of the way to kind of formulate that. What we talked about with the coffee, or we talked about with the hand, that it was the motor neurons and so on. We can talk about with the coffee that there's, the warm air that we just have in Chengdu during the day, even if we have air conditioning on, the warm air is causing the coffee to become warmer. So my nerves need to react and my muscles need to react in order for my hand to move. So a way to think of this is you have potential 1. So for something to go from potential point 1 to actual point 1, there has to be something already, an actual point 2, that can make that happen. But then something else, an actual point 3, has to make that actual point 2 go from potential point 2 to actual point 3, and so on. You can have potential actual 4 that makes the actual 3 go from potential point 3 to actual point 3. So you keep going back. So what we have is a series of changers, right? There's a series of changers. And you can think of this in 2 different ways. One of the ways was the way when I talked about the coffee, that it's actually over time. That would be a linear change, because it took time for it to get warm. It had to do with the air, which was warmed by the sun, which was warmed by, so you go back in time, and that all that time caused the gradual change from cold to hot. Something a little bit more here and now is like the hand. Now, of course, there is some time involved, And so what we see here in terms of the series of changers is that you can have either go from early time to present time to something like a cup that's sitting on a table. So when I look at the cup and I say, okay, the cup is on the table, what is supporting the cup? And, well, the table is, what is supporting the table? The legs of the table. What's supporting the legs of the table? The floor. And what's supporting the floor? Well, the building. What's supporting the building? The earth, and so on and so forth. That kind of relationship is hierarchical, okay? So even though we're not thinking of that as a kind of change, essentially it is, because it allows something to actually exist in its place at that time. And so in a sense, that the here and now-ness of the potential and the actual is another way to think about it, to slice it across instead of it being in time, to think of it as just right here, right now. That this change from my hand moving to the left happening right now, not going back in time very deeply, but just right now. Why does that happen right now? That's more fundamental. To Aristotle's idea, it's the hierarchical change that's more fundamental. So talking about the here and now is more fundamental than talking about how things started and progressed to this point. The motor neurons that are firing here and now are because other neurons are firing here and now. So they happen here and now. And I guess motion, constant motion could be thought of it that way. That, you know, as I'm moving like constantly, and I guess this could get into the physics of it, because as we look at, common sense would tell us that, okay, the cup is just sitting here, and there's no change. But in fact, maybe this is itself is a kind of change. The sitting cup on the table is a kind of change in some sort of physics formula. But even in motion, when we have something in motion, there's a here and now that's causing that to happen. So one level of here and now reality is actualized by another, which is actualized by another, which is actualized by another. Okay? So that's an important difference than the idea of the first cause, because the first cause has to be one thing that happened back in time, and then there was another thing that happened, and then another thing that happened, and another thing that happened, and each of those were causes. Okay? And instead, we're just saying there's the here and now. So the conclusion that Aristotle makes is that we would have a vicious regress of actual becoming potential, becoming actual, and you'd have it going on and on and on forever, unless there was something at the very bottom, like a bottom level that doesn't need to be actualized, but can actualize. So this thing at the bottom would be a purely actualized actualizer. And I'm sorry that the video that kind of blocks that from being seen on the slide, but it's a purely actual actualizer. And the pure actual is changing things without needing to be changed, or something changing it. So in other terms for it are an unmoved mover or an unchanged changer, a purely actualized actualizer. So what makes that purely actual actualizer God and not just some other thing? So that's a question that I would pose to you. Why should this be God? Why can't it just be something? One of them is, if change is going from a potential to an actual, and this purely actual actualizer is purely actual, it has no potential, right? And we talked about potential means that it has to have some ability to then change. So it's actually fully actual already. It's not capable of changing. So if it's unchanging, then it must be outside of time and space, right? Because everything in time and space has to change, right? So if everything in time and space are susceptible to change, that means that this purely actual actualizer has to be outside of time and space. So we could say one attribute is that purely actual actualizer, he or she is, or it is unchangeable and is outside of time and space. So material things are also capable of changing, right? They're made of parts. Every material thing has parts, and those can be rearranged. You know, no matter how hard they are, we can probably find eventually a way for most things to be rearranged that are material. So we know that the purely actualizer can't be material. Can't be an actual material thing. Whenever we see power manifested, another point, like picking up, when I said I was picking up the cup, or an earthquake knocking over a boulder or whatever, you witness this kind of change. So since there's a power that's involved, we can say that the purely actual actualizer is the source of all power. That there's power behind that source, and it must be completely powerful, because otherwise it wouldn't have the ability to cause changes. So we can have a basic definition for this thing, which we can call God, because 1, he's unchanging, 2, he's outside of time and space, 3, he's immaterial, 4, he'd be omnipotent, and there's others. And you can see the phaser reading if you want to see some of the other conclusions that he comes to for that. And this fits actually a lot of the traditional Judeo-Christian views of who God is. So what are some criticisms we can pose to the Aristotelian proof? We can't pose the criticism, what caused God for this one, because it's not saying that everything has a cause. It's saying that everything that's potential to be actualized needs an actualizer. So by definition, God would not have the potential to change. So therefore, he does not need to be changeable. So, but one question we might ask is, why can't there be just this vicious regress? Do you remember what the regress is again? It would be something like this. So you have actuals that are affecting a potential that then affects another potential, which affects another, or another actual, which then affects another potential, which then affects another actual, and you can keep going forward. But why can't you just keep going backwards? You can just keep adding to this. So then there was a potential before that, and that potential turned into actual because there was another actual before that, and you can keep going that way. Why can't it just keep going and going and going, basically from here this way, but just forever, right? Why is that not possible, or is it possible? Why can't we just say that then we don't have to propose that there's God, right? If we can just keep going on and on and on, then we don't have to worry there's no God, right? What would be wrong with that, or what would be right with that? Is that the correct solution to this?
Because maybe I think the time is linear. We cannot come back to the past.
Yeah, so we can never see the past, right? There's no way to ever have direct evidence of the past. So is it possible then that it can keep going on and on and on in the past? Is it possible that there's no bottom part? There's no bottom to this change of potential and actual and potential. There might be what?
The unlimited, infinity.
Unlimited. Okay, there could be, right? Okay, so why? Well, why is that true or
This
not true?
process is almost like change, from the potential part change to the active part. So things always change, so we cannot know what is the head of this thing, this potential or active. So I think the whole process is unlimited.
Okay, so you think that the whole process is unlimited because
Things is always changing.
because it's already changed. It's changing now, so why not just changing then, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a good point. Any other comments on this? Why can't there just be a vicious regress? So if you don't have a bottom level to the actual becoming a potential to becoming an actual series, then you don't have an explanation. Do you have an explanation for why it just keeps going on and on and on? Or, do you have an explanation for that?
There's no explanation.
There's no explanation. So you have to keep deferring the explanation, right? You never can get to an explanation of this cause and effect going on in a potential to actual change. So, and if you don't have an explanation, then you can't really explain all the way back up to why the hand moved to the left in the first place, right? You actually then reasonably we have to say, well, then there's really no explanation for why the hand moved. But actually, we do have an explanation for why the hand moved. We have it because the muscles and the neurons in the structure and so on and so forth. And then we just keep going back and back and back. So then it would only make sense that there has to be some explanations. We can't just say there's no explanation. Because then we have to say that there's no explanation all the way to the very end, which seems absurd. Or it is absurd. So why can't there just be no explanation at all? And that was one thing that you brought out, is why can't there be no explanation at all? And so why? Why can't there be no explanation? It's called the principle.
Oh, PSR.
Yeah, PSR. The principle, this is really important. Principle is sufficient reason. This is one of the things that if you agree or disagree with it, you need to have very firm kind of reasoning why you would disagree or agree with it. It's a very complex, if you think it's very simple, it's a very simple concept, but it's very difficult to argue against, actually. Very difficult to argue against. So if you agree that if you believe in this, I don't know if you do or not, but if you believe in the principle of sufficient reason, then you wouldn't be able to just throw your hands up and say there's no explanation for why there's just an infinite regress of actuals and potentials, right? If you believe in this, then you have to say at some point there must be one actual that doesn't need any potential, that it can just actualize potentials. So in any other intellectual context, I'll give you an example for why also this makes sense, is that in any other intellectual context than, say, in the context we're in, say you're in a chemistry lab, okay, and your teacher tells you, do not put these two chemicals together. Okay, and you decide you go ahead and do it. Okay, then there's a big explosion, in the class, and the teacher comes up to you and says, "So why did that happen?" And you say, "There's no explanation." Yeah. So, right? So do you think your teacher would take you seriously?
No.
Probably not, right? The teacher would be kind of like, okay, I think I know what he did, So because the thing is that we just know that there is usually always an explanation, and ultimately, even if we can't find the explanation, we know that there is going to be at some point an explanation. Okay, so now we will be looking at the Neoplatonic proof. So this Neoplatonic proof originates in Plato, who you can see up here on the screen. Plato lived about 428 to roughly 347 BC, somewhere in there. And later on, after he died, about maybe 500 years later, roughly, a new appreciation for Plato started to occur. Actually, even later, and it went on even later until about 400 or 500 AD. And that was a resurgence. So there was a time that Plato, when he was alive, was very popular and he had very influential. But then there was a period of time people didn't really read Plato as much. And then he became kind of popular again as a thinker. And there was another guy that has a very similar name to Plato. His name was Plotinus. And Plotinus resurrected a lot of Plato's ideas and is often known as Neoplatonism. So there's Platonic thought, Platonism, and then there's Neo being new. So the Neoplatonic proof kind of comes from Plato, but then it comes from another guy named Plotinus. So I don't have Plotinus up here right now, but you can look him up and see and learn something about him online. So the proof goes like this. That everything is made in parts, right? Can you think of anything that's not made up of some sort of parts? We can say that from kind of that standpoint that things don't exist unless, the things that we mostly see and interact with, or everything, I guess, only exists when it's combined. And so when we trace the things down to their ultimate cause, it must end in something that does not have parts. And that would mean that something is non-composite or that's absolutely simple. So the question is, what is that absolutely simple thing? So that would be the argument for God would be that if we could just break everything down, all the way down to the subatomic, below whatever the subatomic is, or what, if we can finally get to that very thing that is keeping everything together, everything, not just one or two things, but everything, that has to be God. So why does it have to be God? Why can't it be something else than God? No, according to Neoplatonic proof, God's the one that combines all the parts, but or is what keeps things combined. He is below everything that in the here and now. That if you keep looking at everything and dividing it into its smaller and smaller parts, that eventually the argument is that you're going to get down to something that can't be divided. It's the most simple thing that cannot be divided. So similar to when we look at the subatomic particles, that at some point, those are the most simple things, right? And maybe those are the only thing that hold everything together. And below that, I guess that's what people would claim is then, that are using this argument, would claim that below that is what's holding those things together in place, or below that, or below that, or below that. But whatever point you get to, when you get lower, it's not going to keep going on forever and ever. At some point, you'll hit a rock bottom of reality that holds all of these things together. So this is an interesting problem, the problem of the Neoplatonic proof. I want you guys to think about that and see if you can come up with some ideas to argue against it. Then another proof that we have gone over in this reading has been the Augustinian proof. So Augustine lived from 354 to 430 AD. This is a painting of him, as we have no direct paintings of him during his life, but you have later, he became a saint. He was considered one of the founders of the church, the early Christian church, and he was also a philosopher, wrote some very influential books such as The City of God. And he started off, actually, he had his mother was some sort of, his mother was a Christian, but he didn't actually want to become a Christian for his youth. He wasn't interested in that. But later on in his life, he made a conversion to Christianity, and he became very studious and ended up, becoming a bishop. So he was kind of a leader in the church, and ended up having a great impact on his society, both at that time and in the future. What was interesting about him also is that he's from northern Africa. So he was a Berber, what we call a Berber, which is a kind of people group that comes from northern Africa, and in a place called Hippo. So he's known as Augustine of Hippo. But one of the founders, so a lot of people don't realize that Christianity is a combination of, well, it actually comes from the East. It's not a Western idea. It comes from Judaism. Judaism is part of, it comes from Israel, and it's really a Middle Eastern idea, plus African. You can say there's a lot of influence from Africa, northern Africa, and then the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. So the Augustinian proof is that there are certain truths that are both necessary and eternal. So what would be some of these necessary and eternal truths? Can you think of any? Here are some what I would call necessary and eternal truths. So what we talked about triangles. When you guys weren't here, we talked about triangles have to have 3 sides, right? And each of the angles have to add up to 180 degrees. This is both necessary and eternal. So in other words, there was no starting point that said all triangles have to be 3-sided and add up to 180 degrees for angles. And there's no end to that. Like, there's no time that it won't be like that, and there's no time that it started like that. So it's eternal. It's necessary because it can never not be true. It has to be true. There's no way you can say, well, we can sometimes have it be, 181 degrees that all the angles add up to. Sometimes it can be 4 sides. Sometimes it can be 3 sides. No, it's always that way, and it will not be a triangle anymore. The triangle loses its definition once you change those things. So that's an example of also what we would call a universal or an object of thought. This is no longer something material anymore. We're talking about an object of thought. It's something that's universal, and it's universal because anyone can arrive at that from anywhere at any point in time. It's also what's called an abstract object. So another thing is like math. 1 plus 1 equals 2. So that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is necessary. There's nothing I can do that can make that not be true. It's always going to be true. It has to be true. 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's also eternal. It's never started being true, and it never will stop being true. It's always true. So there's another kind of thing that we can say is necessary and eternal and is a kind of universal, and those are propositions. So, for example, if I say a proposition, the snow is white. Now, the sentence doesn't really matter. You can have the sentence be in German, it can be in Chinese. 你可以说雪是白色的. The same meaning, the same proposition is true, whether or not you change the structure of the sentence. So this is a proposition, and so these things are also objects of thought or abstract objects. As I mentioned before, math is another example of this. So 1 plus 1 equals 2 never started being true and never will stop being true, and it couldn't possibly not be true. That's another important thing to think about. There's never a time that it can stop being true. So this is kind of reviewing what we were talking about earlier today. What are possible worlds? Remember how we talked about this? What are possible worlds in philosophy? Can there be a possible world where 2 plus 2 equals 5?
There might be.
There might be. Okay, that's one idea. What about another idea? Is it possible to have a possible world with a square circle? Can there be a possible world with a square circle? Okay. Can somebody get up on the board and draw me a square circle?
I can't imagine.
Well, the reason you can't imagine it is because it's impossible.
That's impossible.
Right? Because it's taking 2 different definitions. You're taking a definition. What's the definition of a square?
4 angles and organized with 4 something.
Right. 4 sides, 4 angles. That's how you get a square. And for a square, it has to be equal sides. They have to be equal. Rectangles can be unequal.
Too long, too short.
Right. But in a square is a type of rectangle. Pi times the radius squared is the diameter, or is the area of a circle. So those different definitions by nature cannot be combined. There's no combination. And it's the same actually with 2 plus 2 equals 5. Actually, because now, of course, you could say, well, we can redefine 2 to mean something else, but that's just changing the language. That's just what we'd say an argument from semantics. But my point is that actually it's an impossibility. It's an impossibility that 2 + 2 = 5. It's an impossibility that there's a square circle. And from the Augustinian point of view is that in possible worlds, you can't have things that are logically incoherent. It still has to abide by things that can be possible. There's 3 kinds of ways of looking at these things that we call universals. So it's a problem, right? Like, okay, so are all verbs in all languages, when we talk about verbs and nouns, are we talking about the same thing? Is it a universal thing, or is it specific to each language? So, or are these concepts, mathematical concepts, triangles and stuff like that, is that a universal thing? Is that real? Or is it just because it's in our minds as humans that we've organized it in a certain way and we think of it in our own minds? So that these differences have been discussed all throughout the ages, and there's 3 different ways that people have put them together. They've put them together as in concepts where, yes, they are real. So some people say, yes, definitely, these things are real. The concept of a triangle, the mathematical formulas, these are real things. That's called realism. To believe that universals are real. And other things could fall into that place too, like love, compassion, forgiveness, anger, hatred. These things could also be potentially universals, and those would be real things, even though we can't necessarily find a material connection, or maybe there's a material answer, but there's no material thing called love. You can still think of it as a universal, real thing. Other people would say, no, it's not a real thing. In fact, it's not just not a real thing, it's only words. We're only talking about words. So when we talk about a triangle, we're just talking about, we just have words and definitions for that. It's not a real thing. It doesn't really exist. We just have a way of talking about it, of explaining it. It's all in our heads, but it's not just in our heads. It's just mere words, and that's called nominalism. So nominal coming from the word noun or thing. It's just a thing. It's not a real thing. It's a thing that we maybe would talk about. Conceptualism is a little bit different than nominalism. It's very similar to nominalism, but it would say these are just concepts. So they're in our minds. We just happen to share them all in our minds, but they're just part of the neural, evolutionary, biological parts of our minds. And so they're not real. If we got rid of humans, 2 + 2 could equal 5. If we got rid of humans, math would no longer exist. There would be no math. There would be no laws of science. There would be no laws of science. Without humans, the only science exists only because humans exist, or the laws of science, I should say. Science only exists because of humans is true. But the laws of science, the things that we've actually discovered through science, only exist because humans exist, and that's in their minds. That's conceptualism. So, what are some arguments for why realism is true? Why would anybody accept realism? So maybe realism isn't true, but what would you argue in its favor? Or against it, actually. Argue for it or against it. And this has to do actually with realism. So these are different, there's 10 different ones that Fazer puts in his book, and you can read each of those for why he argues that realism must be true. One over many argument, the argument from geometry, we kind of talked about that already. Argument for mathematics, we kind of talked about that too. I said, I could have brought my phone to class, but I didn't, but 1 + 1 = 2, and that's a necessary truth. Argument from the nature of propositions, argument from science, scientific laws, also point to realism being true. The argument from the nature of possible worlds, the vicious regress problem, which is something that we kind of talk about with the principle of sufficient reason. The worlds are a universal problem. The worlds are universal too problem. The argument from the objectivity of concepts and knowledge, and the argument from the incoherence of psychologism. Okay, so just to review these concepts, so we think about redness. If we thought about redness separately, we can't say that there is nothing in common between your thought and mine. The Pythagorean theorem, we talked about how your thoughts on it and my thoughts on it are one and the same truth, and that people long dead had these thoughts, and that they were true then, and just as they're true now, so that somehow these truths are universal. And then the argument from the objectivity of concepts and knowledge, yes, so if the human race died out, we would have the possibility that new intelligent life forms could arrive at some point, and if they did, they would inevitably at some point arrive at the same universals and propositions that we have. And even if they didn't, those things would still be true. So the Augustinian proof also, well, we mentioned that there's this argument from the objectivity of concepts and knowledge, but also against this idea of psychologism. And you have this philosopher, Gottlob Frege, who lived in the 19th century. And he argues that this psychologism is incoherent. So do mathematical truths describe objective truths? And his answer is yes. And then are all our concepts, and this is something for you guys to answer here too, is that would you say that all of our concepts are culturally conditioned? Are our concepts just conditioned by the culture that we're in, or are our concepts actually engaging with things that are real outside even our culture, our own culture?
It's based on our culture.
You think it's based on our culture? But is there, and why would you say that?
Because different cultural background, because America and China, the people have different understanding of some facts.
Okay. What about like things like 2 + 2 = 4? Is that a culturally conditioned thing?
About 2 + 2 is all the same.
It's all the same, no matter what culture you're in. And so then we can't say all concepts are culturally conditioned. We'd say maybe there's a lot that are culturally conditioned, and sure, there's probably a great many that are culturally conditioned. But there's some. It seems that there's some concepts that doesn't matter what culture you're from. It just exists. Is that fair to say? And one of the reasons for that is because it's hard to argue. If you argue that there are some that there's no concepts that aren't conditioned by our culture, then how do you even make that argument? What is your basis for making that argument? It would be another culturally conditioned argument, according to your view. So if that's just a culturally conditioned argument that's helping you make your culturally conditioned argument, then you're basically your reasoning is circular, because you don't have actually any basis for saying why you're saying that something is true. You're going to always be deferring yourself to a belief that it's conditioned by your culture, and so there's no way you can actually convince. So the only way to convince people that a concept is culturally conditioned is to have objective viewpoints that point to the basis for that, which you're utilizing universal concepts at that point. You have to utilize universal concepts to demonstrate when things are culturally conditioned, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So there's 3 forms of realism, and these are Platonic, Aristotelian, and Scholastic. So I'll tell you. So that just quickly, the first one, Platonic, has to do with this like world of ideas, and the idea of the world of ideas is basically like this third world, and that affects these concepts that we have, and then those concepts that are universal concepts. So that in this world of ideas, it's all going on, and somehow whoever's in that world of ideas then affects these concepts, and then from these concepts you get our world, and you have an interaction with these concepts. But you never interact with that world of ideas that's on the way out, on the outside, that is feeding in these concepts, these universal concepts. The Aristotelian perspective is that they're still universals, but they all come from the fact that there's particular things in the world. And then the last point from the scholastic point of view we'll look at here. Okay, backing up, scholastic realism is different from Platonic and Aristotelian realism in that Aristotelian realism said that the universals come from particulars. Platonic realism said that the ideas are where the universals, this world of ideals, or a third realm, is where the universals come from. Whereas the scholastic realism says that there are some things that instantiate the reals, or the universals, but then there's the mind of God, or the divine intellect, that instantiates other universals. And then the argument goes that since there are some truths that can only be true and can never not be true, and that there are eternal and necessary truths, then these truths need a mind that can contemplate them, and thus it's the eternal and necessary truth requires an eternal and necessary mind, or an infinite intellect, and that would be considered to be God.